There are saints whose holiness seems to begin in innocence, almost as though grace had sheltered them from the deepest storms of the human heart. And then there are saints whose lives are marked by turbulence, contradiction, passion, pride, tears, wandering, and long resistance before surrender. Saint Augustine belongs to the second kind. He does not stand before us as a man who was always calm, always pure, always ready. He stands before us as a man of immense intellect, deep hunger, fierce desire, and painful unrest. He is one of the greatest minds in Christian history. But before he became a light for the Church, he was first a soul in conflict with itself. That is why Augustine remains so powerful. He is not simply the story of a saint. He is the story of a human being laid open. In him, one sees the force of intelligence without peace, desire without rest, ambition without fulfillment, and the long exhaustion of a soul that keeps searching for happiness in the wrong places. He did not drift into sanctity. He struggled toward it, resisted it, fled from it, argued against it, and yet, all the while, was being pursued by the mercy of God. His life is not compelling merely because of his later greatness. It is compelling because it is so painfully true. He knew lust, vanity, intellectual arrogance, confusion, emotional attachment, grief, ambition, and the torment of wanting to change while still loving what kept him from change. In Augustine, the Church does not present a simplified saint. It presents a heart at war, a mind on fire, and a life slowly conquered by grace. And perhaps that is why his voice still reaches across the centuries so strongly. Many people can admire saints who were always faithful, but Augustine speaks directly to those who know division within themselves. He speaks to those who hunger for truth but are entangled in desire. He speaks to those who are clever enough to justify their own wandering, and wounded enough to know that justification does not heal. He speaks to those who have tasted the world deeply and still remain unsatisfied. Above all, he speaks to every restless heart. For Augustine's life is, in the end, one long revelation of a truth he himself would later express with unforgettable beauty: the human heart remains restless until it rests in God. Before Augustine became a bishop, before he became a saint, before he wrote books that would shape Christian civilization, he was simply a boy born in North Africa, in the town of Tagaste. In the year 354, the place mattered. He did not emerge from Rome, from the glittering center of power, nor from some ancient sacred city already wrapped in prestige. He came from the provinces of the late Roman world, from a family that was not rich, from a setting where greatness would not have been predicted by outward appearances. His father, Patricius, was not a Christian for most of Augustine's youth. His mother, Monica, was. That distinction matters deeply, because from the beginning Augustine's life stood between different spiritual currents. He was not raised in a house of total unbelief, nor in a house of perfect unity. The Christian faith was present in his childhood, but it was not yet the center of his will. It touched him before he loved it. It surrounded him before he surrendered to it. And there was something else in him from the start: brilliance. Augustine was not ordinary in intellect. He learned quickly. He showed unusual aptitude for study, especially for language and rhetoric. He was gifted, and everyone around him could see it. But here already one of the great tensions of his life appears. Intelligence can become a ladder toward wisdom, but it can also become the pride that keeps a soul from kneeling. Augustine's mind would one day glorify God with astonishing depth. But first, it would become a place of vanity, ambition, and restless self-assertion. Even as a boy, he later confessed, there was disorder in him. He did not remember his youth as a golden field of innocence. He remembered impulses, selfishness, disorderly loves, and a will already inclined toward itself. This is one of the reasons Augustine's self-knowledge remains so striking. He did not romanticize his beginnings. He looked back with sharp honesty. He knew that the roots of his later wandering did not appear suddenly in adulthood. They were already hidden in the soil of his younger years. That honesty is part of what makes his life so trustworthy. He is not interested in presenting a flattering legend of himself. He is interested in truth. And truth begins close to the wound. He knew he had been gifted. And he also knew those gifts did not make him good. He knew he had been loved. And he also knew he did not yet know how to love rightly in return. So the boy from Tagaste carried within him already the seeds of both greatness and ruin. A sharp mind, a strong will, a heart capable of large desire, a life touched by Christian influence, a mother who prayed, a father who still stood elsewhere, a world that offered advancement, a soul not yet at peace. The future saint was there, but hidden under layers of unrest that would take years to strip away. As Augustine grew older, the force of his intelligence pushed him toward a larger world. Study, rhetoric, advancement, recognition, these became part of the road before him. He was drawn not only to truth, but to brilliance, not only to meaning, but to success. He wanted to rise, to distinguish himself, to be known for the sharpness of his mind and the elegance of his speech. And in the late Roman world, rhetoric was no small thing. It was power, prestige, influence, and entrance into the world of cultivated men. Yet ambition alone does not explain Augustine, for along with ambition came passion. He was not a cold intellectual. He was a man of appetite, a man easily inflamed by desire, a man whose body and heart would not remain quiet beneath theories. That is why his life feels so modern, so psychologically alive, even after so many centuries. He did not sin in an abstract way. He sinned with intensity. He did not merely make detached mistakes. He gave himself over to loves that were disordered, powerful, and difficult to relinquish. In his later writings, especially in the Confessions, Augustine looked back on this part of his life with a mixture of sorrow and frightening clarity. He saw how deeply lust had shaped him, how desire could intoxicate the will, how the soul could become divided against itself, not because it had stopped wanting happiness, but because it had mistaken pleasure for peace. He was not unaware of his own bondage. In many ways, the tragedy was that he knew enough to feel the contradiction, but not yet enough to escape it. This is where Augustine becomes much more than the story of a gifted young man who made bad choices. He becomes the portrait of the human will entangled. He wanted what was high, yet he also wanted what pulled him downward. He desired truth, but he also desired possession, sensation, admiration, and indulgence, and this split would become one of the defining pains of his life. He was not wholly deceived. He often knew he was not whole, but knowing that one is divided is not the same as being able to become one. Many souls understand this more than they realize. They know what it is to admire the good and yet feel dragged by something else. They know what it is to resolve and then fail, to see clearly and still choose poorly, to long for purity while continuing to love impurity. Augustine lived inside that division, and because he lived inside it so honestly, he became one of its greatest interpreters. His ambition and desire fed each other. The more he sought worldly ascent, the more he drifted toward the habits and attachments of the world. The more he indulged desire, the less free he became. And yet all of this unfolded under the gaze of a mother who watched, grieved, and prayed. Augustine may have seemed to the world like a rising young intellectual. But under the surface, the fracture was already widening. His gifts were real, his unrest was also real, and the two would collide more painfully with every passing year. No truthful story of Augustine can ever be told without Monica. To speak of his wandering without speaking of her tears would be to cut out one of the deepest human and spiritual threads in the whole drama. She is not merely a background figure. She is one of the great silent presences in the story of grace. Augustine would become famous. Monica would become holy in a different way, through patience, sorrow, and prayer that refused to die. She watched her son grow in brilliance and drift in soul. That combination can be especially painful. There is one kind of grief in seeing a child weak and lost. There is another kind in seeing a child gifted, admired, capable of greatness, and yet inwardly moving farther and farther from God. Augustine was not ordinary in promise. Monica knew this, And because she knew it, she also understood, in a mother's way, the scale of what was being lost. He was not simply a sinner in some vague sense. He was a son with a magnificent mind and an unquiet heart. Choosing paths that would wound him deeply. He pursued ambition. He gave himself to lust. He moved through false teachings. He resisted the simplicity of Christian surrender. And Monica could not drag him back by force. She could only remain faithful in the long agony of waiting. What makes Monica so moving is not only that she prayed, but that she endured the terrible slowness of grace. There are conversions that happen quickly and seem to reward prayer almost at once. Augustine's did not. Years passed, tears passed, disappointments passed, false starts passed. There were moments when he moved farther away instead of nearer. Yet Monica did not stop. This perseverance matters because it reveals something about love purified by God. Human love often wants immediate results. It wants proof. It wants closure. It wants relief from uncertainty. But Monica loved through uncertainty. She carried her son before God over and over again while seeing no final answer yet. In that sense, she became one of the hidden foundations of his eventual conversion. She suffered what she could not fix, and offered it. Augustine later remembered her not simply as a good mother, but as a woman whose spiritual fidelity ran deeper than his rebellion. Her tears became part of the story of his salvation, not because her tears forced God's hand, but because in the mystery of grace, her patient intercession belonged to the path by which God was already reaching him. There is a severe beauty here. Monica could not live Augustine's conversion for him. She could not think for him, repent for him, or surrender for him, but she could remain near God while her son wandered far. And often that is what holy love looks like, not controlling, not despairing, not collapsing, but staying kneeling in the dark until morning comes. Because of her, Augustine's story is not only the story of a sinner and God. It is also the story of a mother and her son, of prayer stretched across years, of grief that did not close in bitterness, and of the mystery by which one faithful soul can carry another in hope longer than the other could ever deserve. Augustine did not wander because he was intellectually lazy. In fact, one of the tragedies and glories of his story is that he wandered while genuinely searching. He was not content with superficial religion. He wanted explanations. He wanted coherence. He wanted to know what evil was, what the soul was, what truth was, why the world was as it was, and how one could live wisely within it. This longing made him noble. It also made him vulnerable. For a time, he became attracted to Manichaeism. It offered him what seemed, at first, to be intellectual seriousness and a grand explanation of reality. It promised answers to the problem of evil. It flattered the rational mind by presenting itself as deeper and more sophisticated than the Christian faith Augustine had encountered in simpler form during childhood. To a proud young intellect, that mattered. This part of Augustine's life is essential if one wants to write him truthfully. He was not only entangled in lust, he was also entangled in ideas. And those entanglements mattered because he did not merely want pleasure, he wanted meaning. He wanted a worldview that would satisfy the mind while allowing him to continue avoiding full surrender. False systems often attract precisely because they seem to offer depth without demanding conversion of the whole life. But over time, Augustine began to feel disappointment. The promises of the false paths did not match their substance. Their answers did not hold. Their confidence exceeded their truth. The mind that had once been impressed began to grow dissatisfied. This dissatisfaction, however, was not yet peace. It was another form of restlessness. The old structure no longer satisfied, but the true one had not yet been embraced. This stage of his life is spiritually revealing. Many people imagine conversion as the movement from obvious darkness into obvious light. Augustine's life shows something subtler and more painful. Sometimes a person must first discover that the thing he thought was light is not bright enough. Sometimes false clarity must collapse before true clarity can be desired. The soul passes through disenchantment before it reaches surrender. In Augustine, the search for truth became a long interior battlefield. His intelligence prevented him from resting easily in shallow error forever. But his pride prevented him from quickly kneeling before revealed truth. He was too serious to remain fully satisfied by falsehood, and too self-enclosed to submit easily to the truth when it came near. This tension sharpened everything in him. That is why Augustine's journey speaks so strongly to thoughtful people across generations. He knew what it was to be trapped not only by desire, but by intellect misdirected. He knew what it was to admire systems, to be seduced by complexity, to resist simple surrender because it seemed beneath the dignity of the mind. And he also knew, eventually, what it was to discover that the problem was not that Christianity was intellectually poor, but that he himself had not yet become humble enough to receive its depth. The false roads therefore were not wasted merely as mistakes. They became part of the painful schooling by which Augustine learned the limits of human pride. His mind had to be exhausted before it could become teachable. His soul had to discover the dryness of brilliant error before it could thirst rightly for wisdom. There are moments in the lives of saints when the long interior process becomes visible from the outside through the arrival of another person. For Augustine, one of those decisive figures was Ambrose of Milan. Augustine did not go to Milan first as a pilgrim seeking holiness. He went there as a rhetorician, a man still moving within ambition, prestige, and intellectual life. Yet in that city, another kind of voice met him. Ambrose mattered for several reasons at once. He was intellectually serious, he was eloquent, he could speak of Christian truth without the crudeness Augustine had once associated with it. This was no small thing. Augustine had long looked down on Christianity in part because he had judged it through the lens of his pride. It seemed to him at times too simple, too unsophisticated, too unworthy of a mind like his own. Ambrose shattered that prejudice. Through Ambrose, Augustine began to discover that Christian faith was not the enemy of intelligence. It was not beneath the mind. It was deeper than the mind's vanity. Scripture itself began to open differently to him. Passages he had once dismissed started to reveal spiritual and intellectual richness. The Christian worldview no longer looked childish. It began to look inexhaustible. And yet this intellectual shift did not solve everything. Augustine was being moved, but not yet conquered. His mind was softening, his will was still resisting. This is one of the most truthful parts of his story. A person can begin to see the truth before he is willing to live by it. Augustine was increasingly convinced, but conviction is not the same as surrender. The old chains remained, desire remained, habit remained, delay remained. This inner delay is one of the deepest agonies in Augustine's life. He could feel truth coming nearer. He could feel the old excuses weakening. He could no longer hide comfortably inside the errors that once satisfied him. And yet he still could not say yes completely. It was as though his whole life had become a room full of light that he still refused to open fully from the inside. Ambrose did not convert Augustine by force of personality alone. Rather, he helped dismantle the lies Augustine had used to keep God at a distance. He helped show that Christianity could withstand the scrutiny of a serious mind. But once that was shown, Augustine's struggle became even more painful, for now he could no longer blame the faith for his resistance. The battlefield lay exposed within himself. This is where Augustine becomes spiritually luminous in a way almost unbearable to read. He knew the truth was beautiful. He knew Christ was real. He knew the old life was slavery. And yet he still delayed. He still hesitated. He still loved his chains even while beginning to hate them. Few spiritual autobiographies in all history have described so honestly the misery of divided desire. Milan, therefore, was not only the place where Augustine heard good preaching. It was the place where his pride began to crack under the weight of reality. The old architecture of self was weakening. The collapse had not yet come, but the sound of its breaking had already begun. Every long conversion has an hour when struggle becomes decision. For Augustine, that hour came in a garden. By this point, the pressure inside him had become almost unbearable. He was no longer simply curious about Christianity. He was no longer merely dissatisfied with his old life. He had reached a point where delay itself was becoming torment. He wanted to change, and yet he still feared the loss of what he was clinging to. He was suspended between two loves, two futures, two selves. One part of him longed to surrender. Another part whispered, "Not yet." This, "not yet," is one of the most haunting phrases in Augustine's whole story. He knew what he ought to do, but he could not seem to break the final bond. His habits still held him. His desires still spoke with false tenderness. Sin did not appear to him as merely ugly, it still appeared intimate. That is why the struggle was so severe. He was not deciding between obvious beauty and obvious horror. He was deciding whether to let go of the familiar sweetness of what was killing him. Then came the moment he would remember forever. In the midst of anguish, he heard the voice of a child singing, "Take up and read." He took the scriptures, opened to the words of St. Paul, and read the call to abandon revelry, drunkenness, lust, and strife, and instead put on the Lord Jesus Christ. In that instant, what had been gathering for years came to a head. The resistance broke, the divided will was pierced. The light entered decisively. This is one of the most powerful conversion scenes in all Christian history because it is at once dramatic and deeply interior. Nothing outwardly spectacular happens in the political sense. No crowd is watching, no empire shifts, and yet inside one human soul, the world changes. Augustine does not simply decide to improve himself. He is seized. The Word of God enters the precise wound where his struggle has been longest. And suddenly the excuse of delay can no longer survive. What makes the scene so moving is that it is not merely about intellectual agreement. Augustine had already moved far toward belief. The garden is about surrender. It is about the will finally yielding where the mind had already begun to bow. It is about grace becoming stronger than habit. It is about truth no longer admired from afar, but embraced at the cost of everything. And once this happens, the whole shape of his life changes. The old ambitions dim, the old pleasures lose their claim, the old self begins to die. Conversion, in Augustine, is not merely the correction of opinion, it is the reordering of love. That is why the garden scene still has such force for believers. It reveals that grace does not merely inform the intellect. It invades the center of the person. It breaks delay. It overcomes the weary compromise by which the soul keeps telling God tomorrow. Augustine's tomorrow ended there, and when it ended, a saint began to emerge. After the crisis of the garden came a new kind of calm. The battle had not been imaginary, and the surrender was not sentimental. Augustine had crossed a threshold. The old life was no longer something he simply regretted in theory. It had to be left behind in practice. This is one of the reasons his conversion is so compelling. It was costly. He did not merely feel moved. He changed direction. He received baptism in Milan from Ambrose. This moment stands as both sacramental fulfillment and visible death to the old life. For Augustine, baptism was not the decorative addition of religion to a refined intellect. It was rebirth. It was renunciation. It was entrance into the life of Christ. The man who had once wandered through systems, sensuality, and self-importance now came under the sign of grace in a decisive and public way. There is also something very moving in the simplicity of what follows. Augustine did not come out of baptism with a program for fame in the church. He was not yet thinking of episcopal office, theological greatness, or historical influence. At first, the desire was quieter, to belong to God, to live differently, to leave the old ambitions behind. The soul that had been so long divided now wanted singleness. This new beginning was not detached from grief. Conversion often carries a kind of holy mourning, because it reveals how much has been lost in the years of wandering. Augustine did not become a saint by pretending his past had not happened. He carried memory with him, but memory, under grace, stopped being only accusation, it became gratitude. The more he understood how far he had wandered, the more astonishing mercy appeared. His baptism also crowns the hidden suffering of Monica. The mother who had prayed for so many years sees, at last, the answer. It is hard to overstate how beautiful this is. The tears that had once seemed to disappear into silence are now gathered into joy. Yet even here, the beauty is shaded by a deeper seriousness. Augustine's conversion is not the happy ending of a moral tale. It is the beginning of a new life that will require total fidelity. There is something profound in that. Many people think of conversion as closure. In Augustine, conversion is opening. It opens the real work of holiness. It opens the demand to persevere. It opens the path by which the gifts of his mind will no longer be his private glory, but a service to truth. Baptism does not merely comfort him, it claims him. And so the old life begins to die, not all at once in the psychological sense, but decisively in orientation. Augustine is no longer searching as he once searched. He is no longer wandering as he once wandered. The heart that had been restless still feels its need, but now it knows where rest is found. That knowledge changes everything. One of the striking features of Augustine's life is that after conversion he did not simply disappear into private sanctity. For a time, he desired a more withdrawn life, a life of prayer, study, and contemplation. In a way, this is understandable. After such inward tumult, silence would have seemed like mercy. But God had other plans. Augustine was drawn, step by step, into service for the Church. He returned to North Africa. In time, he was ordained a priest, and later became Bishop of Hippo. Here another great transformation becomes visible. The man who had once trained his eloquence for worldly advancement now poured that eloquence into preaching, teaching, defending the faith, and shepherding souls. The tools of his former ambition were not discarded, they were redeemed. This redemption is deeply important. God did not save Augustine by crushing everything he had been given. He saved him by reordering it. His intelligence, his rhetorical power, his ability to penetrate difficult questions, his sensitivity to the movements of the heart, all these became instruments of the Church. The very faculties that might have made him a celebrated worldly figure became, under grace, channels of truth. As bishop, Augustine did not live in abstraction. He dealt with disputes, heresies, pastoral concerns, broken people, practical burdens, and doctrinal battles. His sanctity was not dreamy. It was laborious. He had to think, write, preach, judge, comfort, correct, and endure. This matters because it shows that holiness is not only found in withdrawal from complexity. Sometimes holiness must stand in the middle of complexity and serve there. Augustine's episcopal life also reveals that conversion does not end with one inward breakthrough. It matures through responsibility. The old restless seeker now had to become a father for others. The man who once needed to be instructed now had to instruct. The soul that once could barely govern itself now had to guide a flock. This is not irony, it is grace ripening. There is something beautiful here for every Christian vocation. God often takes the very place of a person's former wound and makes it the place of service. Augustine's past did not disqualify him when redeemed. It deepened his ability to speak to the Church. He understood the divided will because he had lived it. He understood pride because he had known it. He understood desire because it had once ruled him. This gave his teaching unusual force. It was not the cold analysis of an outsider. It was the witness of one delivered. So Augustine the bishop must never be separated from Augustine the convert. The authority of the later man is illuminated by the struggle of the earlier one. His episcopacy was not the cancellation of his past, but the transformation of it into wisdom. And that is one reason he became such a towering figure. He did not only think deeply, he thought deeply from inside a redeemed life. Augustine's influence after his conversion became immense. He was not only a holy bishop, he became one of the greatest theological and spiritual minds in the history of the Church. His writings would shape centuries. His words would enter not only theology, but philosophy, spirituality, political thought, biblical interpretation, and the whole texture of Western Christian imagination. Among his most famous works are the Confessions, The City of God, On Christian Doctrine, and On the Trinity. But their importance lies not only in their titles. It lies in the way Augustine thought. He could move from the most intimate analysis of the human heart to the highest questions about time, memory, evil, grace, and God. Few minds have united personal depth and intellectual breadth as he did. What makes Augustine's teaching so enduring is that it is not merely theoretical. Even when he writes at high levels of abstraction, one feels that his thought has been tested by life. He does not speak about desire as an outsider. He does not speak about memory as a detached observer. He does not speak about grace as a concept only. He speaks as one who has lived the chaos of desire, the burden of memory, and the astonishment of grace. This is why the Confessions continues to feel alive. It is at once prayer, autobiography, theology, and meditation. It is not written in the tone of a man admiring himself after victory. It is written in the voice of a soul still amazed that God followed him so patiently. And that amazement never quite leaves Augustine, even when he became one of the towering authorities of Christian thought. The memory of mercy remained near the center. His greatness as a teacher also came from courage. Augustine did not avoid difficult questions. He faced them: evil, freedom, the will, original sin, grace, scripture, the destiny of the earthly city and the city of God. He entered all of this with seriousness. He helped the Church think, not because he possessed a sterile intelligence, but because he submitted that intelligence to the service of revelation. And perhaps that is the deepest reason he became such a light. He was not merely clever. There are many clever people in history. Augustine was a mind set on fire by a heart that had been conquered. His teaching shines because it is warmed by conversion. He never ceased being the man whose restlessness had found its answer in God. All his greatest thought grows out of that answer. Augustine's life closed not in a world of peace, but in a time of crisis. The Vandals were besieging Hippo. The world around him was unstable. The Roman order that had framed so much of his life was cracking. The old structures of civilization were under pressure. It is fitting, in a way, that the man who had written so deeply about the earthly city and the city of God should die while the earthly order trembled visibly around him. He died in 430, still bishop, still faithful, still within the place of service to which grace had led him. There is something very beautiful in that ending. He did not die as a young convert in the freshness of first surrender. He died after years of labor, thought, prayer, struggle, and pastoral burden. The saint had become fully seasoned. The restless seeker had become a father. The brilliant youth had become a servant of truth. And yet what makes his end luminous is not merely the quantity of what he wrote or the authority he held. It is the inner coherence of the whole journey. The boy from Tagaste, the ambitious student, the lover of pleasure, the seeker entangled in error, the son who made Monica weep, the hearer of Ambrose, the man broken in the garden, the convert at baptism, the bishop of Hippo, the teacher of the church. These are not separate stories. They are one story, and that one story reveals a heart being led, slowly and painfully, into its true home. Augustine's greatness, therefore, is not that he never wandered. It is that he allowed grace to conquer his wandering. It is not that he never loved wrongly. It is that his loves were reordered. It is not that he escaped the human condition. It is that he entered so deeply into its confusion, and yet did not remain there. That is why he still speaks with such force. He knows the soul from the inside. He knows how restless it can be. He knows how it can mistake intensity for peace, pleasure for joy, pride for freedom, and delay for wisdom. But he also knows the other side, the relief of surrender, the sweetness of truth, the cleansing fire of grace, and the deep rest that begins only when God is no longer resisted. In Augustine, the Church received not only a saint, but a witness to the long patience of God. His life says that grace can wait, pursue, pierce, strip, heal, and finally rest a human being in the truth. That is why his story remains one of the most beloved in Christian history. It is not only about one man. It is about every soul that has ever run far and yet been found.